Fake news or real accountability? Is the American media covering President Donald Trump fairly? Welcome to Deep Dive. I'm James Freeman of the Wall Street Journal. Joining me today to discuss news in the age of Trump. Paul Levinson is professor of communications and media studies at Fordham University. He's the author of Fake News in Real Context. Amber Athey is White House correspondent for the Daily Caller, where she covers the press briefings, among other events. And Dr. Tom Coburn is a former two-term Republican U.S. Senator from Oklahoma and also a former member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's now the Nick O'Neill Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Thanks you all for being here. And we should note we call you doctor because you have delivered more than 4,000 babies.
Yeah, great privilege.
So you can actually do something, unlike many members of Congress. So I'll skip the editorial for now, but Professor...
I don't know that was fair.
So Dr. Coburn delivers them, you help educate them, and I'm wondering, as you talk to students, as you study the Trump presidency, you study the media coverage of it, do you see it as fundamentally fair? I think most people would say it's rough treatment, it's tough coverage of the president. Do you think it's warranted?
If anything, I think the press is too easygoing on Trump. Because, first and foremost, there's not a day that goes by when he's not lying about something, making something up. I mean, all politicians lie. All people in office lie.
No, yeah, with the present company accepted, of course.
All human beings lie. It's part of human nature. So that's not surprising that a president doesn't tell the truth. Sometimes, once in a while. But, you know, just yesterday, I heard again this nonsense from Trump about women who are bound and gagged coming over the southern border. And, you know, the first time I heard Trump say that, I said to my wife, you know, that sounds familiar. It was in a movie. I couldn't remember the movie. And then last night there was a report that that comes from some scenes in Sicario, which either Trump or some of his advisors saw. And yet he gets on television and he talks about that as if it's a fact. So the press, if anything, are not reporting frequently enough on the extent to which this person in the White House lies.
Let me jump in there, because factually you're incorrect. There's such a thing as a rape tree. They're all over our southern border, where they bring women across the border, they rape them and hang their underwear in the trees. It's a known fact. It's still occurring. And I don't know if Trump was referring to that or not, but the fact is women are taken tremendous advantage of if they're trying to come across the border to seek freedom and a better life. And so, you know, when we say he's lying, I don't know how you can know he's lying, because there in fact is great reports. I actually saw those trees as a senator when I traveled the border to look at the problem, and they're all over the place.
And the media likes to say that Trump lies when he does this classic Trumpian move, which is an exaggeration or hyperbole. So, for example, when he brought the Clemson national football team to the White House, he said, "We had burgers stacked a mile high." Okay, the president didn't literally mean that they were stacked a mile high. And yet there was a report in the Washington Post that was a fact check of President Donald Trump saying that the burgers were stacked a mile high.
Well, this is the larger issue there. I think it is worth raising this point of you see a lot of media organizations have these lists of Trump's lies, and many of them are, for example, are their misstatements. He had the wrong number on the Times. He claimed to have been on the cover of Time magazine. I forget the numbers. It was 12, and he said it was 15 or something like this. I mean, have the press at times overdone it, given that, as you said, politicians, our previous president promised we could all keep our health care plans. This is not new, presidents making inaccurate statements.
All right, well, first of all, hyperbole is usually not considered a lie.
It is in their fact checks,
well,
though.
When people talk about lies, they usually mean making something up, which in fact did not happen. And, you know, with all due respect to Dr. Coburn, I'd like to see that evidence that you're talking about. I don't doubt if you saw something with your own eyes, but I actually did a little research on this. I couldn't find a single report from a reputable news organization documenting what Trump was saying, and he had like details. The paint was blue. I mean, and there were scenes from that movie which were exactly what Trump was talking about. So
I don't doubt that he cross-referenced it, but the fact is, you know, I'm either a liar or not a liar when we're having this conversation. Myself and several other congressmen and senators experienced this, saw it. We rode on Jeeps, we rode on horseback, we took helicopters. I saw hundreds of trees where that was the case. And we had reports from the Border Patrol saying some of these women died as a result of that. So the fact is I don't know what he was referencing because I didn't hear what he said.
Okay.
But we should not undermine the fact that a lot of women are taken advantage of trying to come to freedom by the mules and others that are out there who are known criminals and gang members who are actually ferrying people across and take advantage of them as they come across.
Well, I think it's fair to say that that many news organizations have noted many bad things that have happened in these caravans, whether the paint color was correct. I don't think that part is in dispute. I guess I'm wondering in a broader sense, do you think maybe the press doesn't give the president enough credit for, like the agenda or not, sticking with the agenda he campaigned on in 2016? I mean, well, is that a sort of more a foundational honesty that he doesn't get credit for?
Well, part of the problem is before Trump even was inaugurated, he had that exchange with Jim Acosta. It was a press conference, January 15th, whatever the date was, 2017, right after the election. And, you know, things were just starting out then. I mean, Trump had received rough coverage during the actual election and the campaign. But that would have been a time for sort of calming things down. And Jim Acosta raises his hand, wants to ask a question, and Trump's response is, "You're CNN, you're fake news. I'm not going to answer your question." That was really the first salvo. So even if the press has overreacted, which I don't think they have all that much, by labeling an organization like CNN fake news, which, by the way, harkens back to Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, who termed the press in the Weimar Republic, which was the democracy that Hitler and the Nazis destroyed, they came up with this term, der Lügenpresse, which is German for the lying press. And then the Nazis proceeded to physically dismantle and destroy the free press in Germany.
But we're now 2 years into the Trump presidency. Isn't the Nazi analogy just really completely over the top? I mean, where is the authoritarian excess that a lot of people feared?
Well, I mean, you tell me.
No, you tell me.
Okay,
all
well,
of his critics in the press are thriving.
Yes,
they're not imprisoned.
No, they're not in prison. But, for example, saying to Jim Acosta much later, after that exchange in the press conference a couple of months ago, that you don't have press credentials anymore, that is the beginning. I don't think Trump has violated the First Amendment per se as yet. He's done nothing as serious as Richard Nixon did when he tried to stop the Washington Post and the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers. So I'm a stickler for respecting the First Amendment, and I'd be the first to say Trump has not violated the First Amendment. But he's certainly making a lot of noise which is moving in that direction. And when you daily denounce the press as the fake press, and then you sort of say they're the enemy of the people, where does that come from? Joseph Stalin used that term.
All right, now we've gone from Hitler to Stalin.
Yeah, well,
we've got a graphic just to remind people what the First Amendment says. Congress can make no law abridging freedom of the press. Is the heart of it in terms of what we're talking about now. This doesn't say, Amber, that the government cannot criticize reporters. It doesn't say that the president cannot have a spirited argument with reporters.
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally dishonest to compare the president's rhetoric to things that dictatorial regimes and authoritarian regimes did to silence the press. The press is in no way silenced in this administration, and if anything, some of what the president says about them actually bolsters them and their credibility among certain segments of the population. A lot of cable networks have experienced rising ratings. CNN is one exception. MSNBC has done incredibly well under President Donald Trump. And in terms terms of the hard pass situation, that wasn't trying to silence Jim Acosta. He can still apply for a weekly pass at the White House like everybody else, like I have to do because I don't have a hard pass yet. And that was in response to a lack of decorum, which every person should have to have when they're in that office and respecting that office.
Doctor, how do you?
I think what we're talking about is the arrogance of Washington and the arrogance that comes with power. I had personal experience with reporters. I related that to you earlier, but I made it a habit.
You wouldn't talk to them if they
lied, or if they editorialized and quote their news article. But I also every night when I went to bed, 11 o'clock, listened to NPR. You know, I was on the floor. I listened. And then I'd hear a report.
Because you just believe in government-owned broadcasting.
No, I listened to it to see if what they said was accurate. And 50% of the time, what they said wasn't accurate. This is National Public Radio.
Okay,
and that's my assessment of what I heard. And I don't listen to NPR at night because I'm in bed a long time before that. But here I think is the problem, is we no longer have respect for institutions. We don't have respect for the presidency because we don't like Donald Trump, quote, unquote. We don't like his narcissism. We don't like some of the things he said. So therefore, we equate Donald Trump with the office of the president. And my big deal with Jim Acosta is he doesn't offer anybody respect. Not even the president.
We want to, Professor,
one quick thing.
Okay, then we're going to go to a clip of Acosta. Okay.
I just want to address the point that you made and tie this to what Dr. Coburn has said. So this point about we shouldn't be too concerned about statements that threaten the press, even though Trump has not actually pulled the trigger and arrested.
Well, when you say threaten, what do you mean when you say threaten?
Well, when you basically say the press is fake news, they're enemies of the people, and maybe something should be done about it.
Who said
I
that?
think that's an implied threat. He did. He said this many times.
Something should be done about it?
Yes. Check the record. He has many times. But let me just ask Dr. Coburn this question. You're a doctor. You're a medical doctor. If you see someone who's smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day and or they're drinking, a quart of scotch a day, you as an MD would be concerned because although the person might be perfectly healthy at that point, you see behavior that's dangerous to that person's body and health and well-being. That's what I see Trump's statements as. They're dangerous. He hasn't yet done anything, but that kind of talk is dangerous to a democracy.
Well, I mark that up to his narcissism. You know, if you look at the language explanation of all his words, he comes back to 2 or 3 themes. And let me tell you, I've been in 39 states in the last 4 years. The American people are sick of Washington, and they're sick of the reporters. They're even sick of Fox at times because Fox gets on the one side too hard than
not Fox.
Fox. So the point is, I hear this. Okay, this isn't Tom Coburn saying it. So the point is it's time to renew the spirit of journalism.
Well, all right, I want to get back to this question of fake news, but first we're going to go to that clip of President Trump and CNN's Jim Acosta. This is not that initial press conference you mentioned, but the more famous one recently that resulted in Mr. Acosta's press credentials being yanked. Let's go ahead and show that one.
I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings would be much better.
If I may ask one other question, Mr. President, if I may ask one other question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President, I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr. President,
that's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other question, if I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have?
I'm not concerned about anything with the Russian investigation because it's a hoax. That's enough. Put down the mic.
Okay, so I'm not sure the sum of human knowledge was advanced by that discussion there, but what preceded it was Mr. Acosta basically seizing the microphone or given his turn at the microphone, rebutting what the president had just said, and incorrectly, I might add. He said, Mr. Trump, this is not an invasion, although the Caravan Group had explicitly said we're going to cross the border illegally en masse. He made a number of statements that weren't so much questions as counterpoints to what Donald Trump was saying. First off, just sort of on a minor level, is there any privilege that Mr. Acosta enjoys? Does he deserve to be there in the White House asking the president questions at a press conference?
No one is entitled to any privilege. However, CNN is one of the 3 major cable news operations, along with Fox and MSNBC, and it would be appalling if CNN didn't have a representative at every news conference. And CNN chose to make Jim Acosta their person at that conference. So in that sense, although Jim Acosta personally was not entitled, I think CNN and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, the major organizations, are entitled to that. Not that it's a crime to not have them there, but it's certainly something that's not consistent with giving the American people the fullest coverage that they could get.
And CNN has dozens of White House reporters. CNN has dozens of White House reporters, and if they wanted to be taken more seriously, then they would do well to put someone besides Jim Acosta, literally anyone else in that position, who is going to ask an information-seeking question of the president rather than to argue with him or unleash a series of statements, which, as you noted, were not even accurate. He claimed that illegal immigrants were not going to be climbing the walls in San Diego. Pictures a week later showed them doing exactly that. Right. It was just a pure editorial moment for him to get in front of the TV camera, and there was no information-seeking methods going on there at all.
Also, this question of fake news. I mean, I think anybody would say we don't want fake news, right? We want to be informed. We want actual facts being disseminated. There is a history with CNN. I don't want to label the whole network fake news, but they routinely hold panels of non-doctors issuing long-distance diagnoses on the president's mental condition.
Okay, first of all, there is a difference between deliberately making up a false story with an intent to deceive. There's a difference between that and, first of all, making a mistake. All news organizations make mistakes. Again, all human beings make mistakes. That's why the New York Times has a little thing at the bottom of most of its front pages where it lists the errors that were made. They didn't deliberately make those errors, but human beings made errors. As far as doctors diagnosing long distance, I don't think
non-doctors.
Non-doctors, that's even worse. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't agree with that. That should be condemned. But that's not really fake news. That's basically people who really don't know what they're talking about, voicing an opinion. Fake news is alleging that this happened, when in fact it did not happen.
Like the fact that Anthony Scaramucci was under investigation by Robert Mueller, for example, which was a story that CNN published with 2 sources.
Yes, but the question is, did they deliberately do that, or were they mistaken?
And that is an important distinction, but I have to wonder, because all of these fake stories are going against the president, you don't see a story corrected that was favorable to the president. All of them go in one direction. You have to question if it's a result of reporters' innate biases that cause them to believe stories that they wish to be true rather than following the facts.
You know, interesting. I talked to somebody who got their master's degree in journalism from Columbia, and he was the only conservative in the class in his bachelor's degree and also in his master's degree. So political philosophy has a lot to do with what we're talking about. We seem to jump around that. But I'd go back to the fact that we're losing virtue in our country. Mm-hmm. Virtue is falling by the side. And so it's free for Jim Acosta to be irreverent, disrespectful, and try to make a name for himself at the expense of the president and everybody in the country who is a news organization covering that. I have to think there's some motivation behind that. And I think it's associated with no virtue, or at least less than honorable virtue, if in fact we want our kids to act that same way.
Okay, now in response though, I don't think you would say fake news, enemies of the people. And to be fair to the president, he always says, I'm not talking about the whole news media, I'm saying purveyors of fake news are enemies of the people. Yeah. Is his rhetoric too harsh?
Well, you know, I think people take Donald Trump with a grain of salt, whether they're his supporter or whether they're his diehard political enemy, because they recognize that he exaggerates, that he will go on a tangent. And so, you know, I don't think he puts out fake news. I think sometimes he really exaggerates and then has to claw it back, but you never see much public clawing back of that. Number two is I think the news media just flat don't like him and don't like the fact that he beat one of their darlings. I mean, you look at the comparison of editorials, pro-Hillary or non-pro-Hillary versus pro-Trump, non-pro-Trump, and it's unbelievable the weighted towards Hillary that was in the media.
You don't dispute there's bias. I think in your view it's justified.
Absolutely. And in fact, I said years ago, why is Fox, the cable Fox News operation, wasting their time saying they're fair and balanced? They're not fair and balanced. Neither is NBC, neither is the New York Times. That's a myth, this myth of being fair and balanced. There's bias in everything that we do. So, but that's not the problem. The problem,
I would say it's much more fair than their competitors, but go ahead.
Okay.
Or our competitors, I should say.
Yeah, I'm not concerned about media that have a point of view and that it's an obvious point of view. People are adults and even teenagers. They know what they're seeing. They can watch what they want and read what they want. What I'm concerned about is the labeling and undermining of media that Trump finds unwelcome in their news reports as not legitimate media. Because what that winds up doing is it weakens our democracy because it gives citizens fewer places where they can go. Let's say you see some kind of insane story on Twitter, which happens all too often, having nothing to do with Trump, just some nonsense, some psycho puts up a tweet about something that's total nonsense. So what do most reasonable people do? They look around at respected news sources and see whether or not they're saying the same thing. Okay, great, this guy didn't die. It was just some lunatic who was putting up some kind of fraudulent thing. What Trump does when he calls media enemies of the people and fake news,
he calls fake news enemies, purveyors of fake news enemies of the people.
Yeah, but those are the media. That's what he's talking about with fake news.
No, he every time, I think just about every time he uses that phrase or every time he says, I'm talking about people who publish fake news or broadcast.
Right.
He's saying, I'm not saying that's true of all journalism.
That's right, but he says CNN, he has said point blank that CNN is fake news. That goes back to January 2017. He said NBC is even worse than CNN. He said that recently, but since he assumed office, he's been saying NBC is fake news. The New York Times gets actually two labels. I guess they should be happy. They're the failing New York Times, and they're also fake news.
And they're thriving in the age of Trump, as we've been discussing.
So let me interject one thing in this. The real problem is writing editorials that are put forward as factual news. That's what I see as the big problem. And I see that in local papers. I see that in national papers. They take a position, and they're supposed to be reporting facts. And in fact, all through it, you see the opinion of the person that authored that, and it's an editorial. It's not a fact-based piece of news. And that's where we've lost the profession of journalism and communications, because what I was taught in my journalism class is nobody should ever know what I think when I write a news article.
Okay, but beyond, I agree with you 100%. We'd like opinion to be labeled opinion and news to be labeled news. But Amber, as you've pointed out, there's also a fundamental problem here where there are a lot of mistakes, particularly on this Trump-Russia story, that somehow always seem to go in one direction.
Right, exactly. I mean, on CNN again, they published a story about Don Jr. and Trump Tower, claiming that Trump knew about the meeting in advance. And then another story about Don Jr. and WikiLeaks claiming that he had advanced access to these stolen Democratic documents. There's the BuzzFeed News story claiming that Trump directed Michael Cohen to lie to Congress. All of these stories come from 2 or fewer anonymous sources. We're never get an explanation as to how these news outlets got these stories wrong. Did their sources lie to them? Did their sources just get the information wrong? Who were their sources? Characterize them for me, because I want to know. And yet all of these organizations, despite the president criticizing them, continue to be successful. They never have to be held accountable for publishing these false reports. So it just seems to me that the argument that the president is somehow undermining the press by criticizing them and calling fake news is just silly.
Well, first of all, they can be held accountable. They're not immune from lawsuits alleging libel or slander, and so
but
someone has
for a president, that bar is so high.
Right.
They're basically immune from a suit from Trump.
Yeah, but they're not immune, let's say, from a suit from Michael Flynn and other people. They're not immune from a suit from Paul Manafort, who has threatened to sue the media but hasn't yet. And so apropos...
even Michael Flynn, once he... Well, first of all, he ran the top intelligence arm of the Defense Department. Once he becomes National Security Advisor, very briefly, he is a well-known public figure. He's in the public arena. Yeah. Again, the bar for him winning a lawsuit.
And I'm not even advocating lawsuits.
Yeah,
I just think that the media outlets should have to explain to the American people why these mistakes keep happening and what they're going to do to prevent them in the future. And I don't see any self-reflection from the media. Instead, I see a woe is me attitude, complaining about the fact that they get labeled a certain way because of a direct result of stories that they publish.
There is some accountability. You mentioned Michael Flynn. So 2017, ABC reported, big story, bombshell. Trump told Flynn to meet with the Russians before the election. It dominated media for, I think, 24 or 48 hours, and then we find out, oh, it was actually after the election when it was totally appropriate. Right. Now, some people did get fired from ABC, so there was a kind of accountability there. But we've seen this pattern. Glenn Greenwald, writing at The Intercept, he's no one's idea of a conservative. He goes through this long list of Trump-Russia story mistakes. You mentioned the CNN report about Michael Cohen. They said that Cohen's lawyer did not comment when, in fact, he was the source for the story. I mean,
but
you don't want to throw around the term fake news, but saying that someone didn't comment when they were your source?
Well, again, I think it's extremely important to differentiate between deliberate deceit and mistakes. And it is wrong to call mistakes in the media fake news, because people make mistakes all the time. And by the way, that didn't begin with Trump. There were mistakes made in reporting about Obama. You just go back. I mean, there were mistakes made about George Washington.
If they're all going in one direction on the Trump-Russia story, you think that's well-meaning people who just suffer from bias, or this is just a bizarre coincidence?
Okay, here's what I think about the Russia story. You mentioned BuzzFeed, and I don't know whether that story is true or not. BuzzFeed is standing by its sources and its story, so that's yet to be determined. But
they're standing by anonymous claims of anonymous sources versus the actual source on the record saying it's not true.
Okay, and I was going to get to that. The reason that people doubt the BuzzFeed story is that Mueller comes out with a statement saying that's not true. So everyone now who thinks it was wrong for BuzzFeed to attack Trump like that suddenly respects Mueller. After day by day savagely criticizing Mueller, and what Mueller has done goes beyond the media. Mueller has gotten indictments. Mueller has gotten confessions. There are people going to jail because of Mueller's investigation. Unless we think our legal system and our judges are somehow in cahoots with the media, that seems to me to be pretty good evidence that what Mueller has been doing regarding his investigation of Trump and Russia and all of the people associated with Trump, he has uncovered some facts that have stood up in courts of law.
But nothing associated with a collusion with the Russians. What he's done is entrapment that any prosecutor can do if they bring those kind of sources on anybody.
It's process crimes.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's a question. If he goes no further, if he never gets that collusion link, you would have to say the American media in general has completely overcovered this story by miles, right?
Yes, but the reason why people who lied were found guilty of that and are being indicted and sentenced to prison is they were lying about what the Trump campaign was doing.
You know that
vis-a-vis WikiLeaks. No, but I think it's a reasonable assumption. What do you think they were lying about?
That's my whole point.
What do you think they were lying about?
You didn't say this is my assumption. You just stated as fact that they were lying.
Yeah. I'm not a reporter. I'm a professor, so I'm saying what I think is reasonable. I'm not claiming to have factually investigated any of these things any more than you have. All that I know is what I read and see, and I try to do some research.
Well, people we need to wrap it up. We're going to give our actual working reporter the last word here, and then we got to go.
Thank you. I just, in terms of the innate bias versus the malintentions, you just see so many stories in this Trump era that range from the silly to the serious, from the Russia collusion stories that are false to the silly stories about Trump dumping too much food in for the goldfish in Japan. There's just so many errors, and I've documented this. I used to be a media reporter, so I've made lists of these fake news stories over and over again.
Okay, well, this sounds like a future segment, perhaps. Professor, Ms. Athey, Doctor, thanhanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to you for joining us on Deep Dive on Fox Nation. Please come back tomorrow. Thanks.